You stand in the narrow shadow of the city walls. The air hangs heavy with dust and heat, carrying the faint stench of sweat, animal hide, and something sour left too long in the sun. From somewhere beyond the gates comes the distant bleating of goats, the low groan of oxen straining against their yokes, and the dull clatter of bronze against stone. The morning is not yet old, but the streets already feel crowded, restless, alive with a tension you can't name. Ahead, the marketplace churns with bodies. Traders shout over one another, linen flaps in the wind like snapping sails, and a clay jar shatters at someone's feet, its contents pooling into the dirt. But no one looks down. All eyes are fixed on the temple steps. A narrow path has formed in the crowd, and through it moves a young woman. She does not look up. Her hands are bound in front of her, the rope biting into skin rubbed raw. Her robe hangs unevenly, one shoulder bare, the fabric at her hem torn and caked with mud. Her hair spills loose over her face, but not enough to hide the trembling in her mouth. The men leading her walk with the calm assurance of those who believe they serve both law and God. Their white linen glows in the sunlight. They do not touch her except to pull her forward, and they do not speak to her. Every word is spoken to the crowd, their voice is steady, practiced, unyielding. You do not yet understand the language, but you feel the weight of their meaning in the air, a verdict already decided, a sentence already begun. It is not the jeering of an angry mob you hear, but the quiet murmur of people who have seen this before. She reaches the foot of the steps. The rope tightens. She stumbles, catches herself, and looks, just once, toward the open sky as if she might find mercy there. The doors of the temple stand open, swallowing the sunlight. Beyond them, shadows wait. This is no wedding procession. It is no simple judgment. What you are watching is something older than memory, sanctioned by the same hands that bless and condemn. A ritual in which the sacred and the profane kneel side by side, and where the body is not a person's own to keep. And yet, this was not their darkest custom. From the days when Israel's tribes were bound only by the fragile thread of covenant law, through the reigns of kings and the shadow of Babylon's looming exile, this land was shaped by an unforgiving order. It was a tribal society, each clan guarding its honor as fiercely as it guarded its wells. A man's standing was measured not only by the fields he owned, but by the obedience of his household, the chastity of his daughters, and the purity of his bloodline. Honor was not an ornament. It was a weapon. Over them all, the temple stood as the center of law and judgment. Priests spoke with the authority of God's own voice, and their rulings carried the weight of both heaven and earth. In disputes of flesh and blood, their verdicts reached into the most private corners of life. The law was not only about theft or murder, it reached into your marriage bed, your body, your most intimate acts. Yet these laws were not formed in isolation. Israel's people lived in a narrow corridor between powers far older and more ruthless, Canaanite city-states, Egyptian kingdoms, Assyrian war machines. With them came foreign gods, foreign rituals, and foreign notions of pleasure and punishment. Some were rejected outright, others seeped in like water through stone, reshaping customs without ever announcing themselves. And always, the same truth prevailed: women's bodies were not theirs to govern. They were property, currency, proof of alliances, and at times, offerings to seal a vow or avert divine wrath. In the eyes of the law, a violation was often judged not by its cruelty, but by whose property was defiled. You may wish to imagine that such rules belonged to distant enemies, the idol worshippers, the heathen nations. But the scrolls of Israel's own prophets, the judgments recorded by its own scribes, tell a harder truth. These acts were not whispered transgressions. They were codified, witnessed, defended. Some of what you are about to hear is drawn from the very texts revered as sacred, not from rumor, not from imagination. To hear them now is not to endorse them, but to confront the reality that the past is often stranger, and more brutal, than we want to believe. If you choose to turn away, you will hear only the stories that flatter history. But if you stay, you will see the shadows that still cling to its edges. And if you believe these shadows should not be forgotten, subscribe to Tale of History now. Because here, we do not close our eyes when the past grows uncomfortable. We open them wider. There was a vow in ancient Israel that could cost more than a man's gold, more than his flocks, more than the roof over his head. It was the vow made in desperation, to win a battle, to cure an illness, to bring rain to a dying field. A man would swear before the altar that he would give to God whatever was most precious to him. Sometimes, that meant coin. Sometimes, livestock. But in the shadow of the temple, another kind of payment took place, one that was never spoken of in the open, yet known by all who lived under its laws. When a vow was made and the payer could not meet it in silver or in grain, a body could be offered in its place. Not the man's body, never his. It was his daughter, his sister, his servant. In the name of fulfilling a holy promise, women could be sent into the service of the temple, service that did not end at the gates, and did not always mean tending lamps or sweeping floors. There were chambers behind the sanctuaries, places where priests or visiting dignitaries were entertained under the cover of ritual. It was said that some of these acts were symbolic unions with the divine, a mingling of flesh meant to mirror the covenant between Israel and its God. But for the women, there was no covenant, only obligation. The law allowed it when wrapped in the language of holiness. A father who refused could be shamed as a vow-breaker. A man who used the service could claim he was honoring God. Yet if a woman acted of her own will, without a vow to justify it, she was branded defiled and could be cast out or worse. Those who benefited were the temple elite, the powerful clans whose vows could be met without emptying their treasuries, the men who could clothe their appetites in the silk of piety. Those who were harmed were invisible, because in the records, they were rarely named. This was not a hidden corner of society. It was a practice carried out beneath the gaze of law and altar alike. A transaction in which holiness was the mask, and the price was paid in silence. If you think this part of history deserves to be remembered, then why are you just watching and not subscribing? You know how quickly these stories vanish from memory, and without your support, they'll vanish from this channel too. In the hills and valleys of ancient Israel, the laws of the covenant thundered from scrolls and lips, commands against the idols of foreign lands, against the altars of Baal and the sacred poles of Asherah. Yet, in the shadows between those words, another truth grew quietly. From Canaan came the whispers of fertile earth and gods who demanded flesh to mirror the planting of seed. From Egypt, the image of priestesses who served both at the altar and in the bed. From Mesopotamia, the rites where union with a woman of the temple was said to guarantee the favor of heaven. These influences did not march in with armies. They seeped in through trade, through marriage alliances, through the slow erosion of borders drawn on maps but not in hearts. Clay figurines of naked goddesses have been found buried in the ruins of Israelite homes, their curves polished by the touch of hands that prayed to both the God of Israel and the mother goddess of their neighbors. Inscriptions on stone hint at offerings made not of grain or incense, but of the body. Offerings that stand in open defiance of the written law, yet were tolerated in the spaces where power and desire intertwined. The official priests would condemn such rites in the public square, but in the quiet halls of the temple, foreign customs were not always cast out. A wealthy man could arrive from a neighboring city-state, bearing gifts for the altar and a request for the service of a sacred woman, and the request could be granted without scandal. The tension between law and practice was not always resolved, sometimes it was simply ignored, so long as the gold kept flowing and the offerings kept burning. And yet, there is evidence, faint, fractured, almost erased, of something darker. A practice so troubling that later scribes seem to have stripped it from the records, leaving only traces in the margins, in scattered words, in the unearthed remnants of a shrine whose purpose was never officially admitted. That story is coming. But when you hear it, you will understand why some would rather it stayed buried. If you're the kind of person who refuses to let the past be rewritten by those who fear it, then you should have already subscribed to Tale of History. And if you haven't, ask yourself, why would you look away now, when the darkest truth is still ahead? Marriage in ancient Israel was not a union of hearts, it was a transaction, calculated as precisely as any exchange of land or livestock. The law allowed for it, regulated it, even sanctified it. A man might secure a wife through the payment of a bride price, silver weighed on scales, handed to her father as though she were a plot of fertile ground changing hands. For those without silver, there were other forms of payment, years of labor in the service of the bride's family, or the spoils taken from war, where women were counted alongside gold and cattle. Child brides were not rare. A girl, scarcely past the age of first blood, could be given to a man decades her senior if the alliance served the family's advantage. In the public square, the betrothal was celebrated, elders as witnesses, blessings spoken, hands bound together to show the joining of households. But in the private chamber, there was no audience for what came next. There, the transaction was completed in flesh, and the girl's voice, if she had one at all, was muffled beneath the weight of duty. Political alliances brought another layer to this practice. A marriage could secure peace between clans, cement a pact between tribes, or open trade routes. Kings themselves used their daughters as tokens in diplomatic games, sending them into foreign courts where their bodies became both pledge and guarantee. These unions were less about love than about leverage, and once the vows were spoken, the cost was paid in a lifetime of submission. Narratives survive in scripture and in law. Stories of patriarchs taking wives for wealth, of brothers trading sisters for land, of widows passed to relatives like inherited property. The customs were legal, even blessed by the words of holy men, yet the human toll is almost invisible in the records. We see the contract, the ritual, the alliance, but not the tears of a girl leaving her mother's arms forever, nor the silence of a wife handed over without choice. If this is making you uncomfortable, it should. That's why Tale of History exists, to dig where others won't. But if you're going to listen without supporting, just admit in the comments why these stories don't deserve to survive. Punishment in ancient Israel was not only about justice, it was about control, and control was often written directly onto the flesh of those least able to resist. The laws of the covenant prescribed penalties for sexual acts with a severity that seems unthinkable now. A woman accused of adultery could face death by stoning, even if her guilt rested on the words of men whose motives were never questioned. A slave woman violated by her master might not see her attacker punished at all, the law often valued her as property, and so any compensation went not to her, but to her owner. There were punishments that did not kill, but still marked a person for life. Public scourging in the square, the shame of shaved hair, garments torn in front of neighbors and elders, each one designed not only to punish the act, but to etch the humiliation into memory. The spectacle mattered as much as the sentence. Some punishments came through ritual, wrapped in the language of the sacred. The ordeal of the bitter water forced a woman accused of infidelity to stand before the priests, her hair unbound, her shame exposed, as she drank a potion of dust and ink. If her belly swelled, she was declared guilty, a verdict delivered not by evidence, but by spectacle and superstition. Whether she lived or died, her name was stained. For outsiders, foreigners, conquered peoples, and those from enemy tribes, punishment could be swift and without recourse. Captive women taken in war might be forced into marriage or servitude, with any act deemed unacceptable punished as rebellion against the conqueror's will. Here, law and power worked together, turning human lives into tools of dominance. Each of these punishments served a deeper purpose. They reminded the community that morality was not only enforced, it was owned by those in power. And that power flowed from men, from elders, from the temple, never from the accused. If you've made it this far without turning away, it's because you understand the cost of forgetting. But if you can watch these stories unfold and still not subscribe to Tale of History, then be honest enough to write in the comments why their suffering isn't worth remembering. There is one custom that slips through the cracks of time, not because it was rare, but because it was too shameful for later generations to record in full. You see it only in fragments, a line cut short, a word replaced, an image blurred by the hand of the scribe. Even the most devout chroniclers hesitated, softening its edges, hiding it in metaphor. It is there in the faint etching of a shard found in Lachish. It is there in a single, jagged verse in Deuteronomy that scholars still argue over. And it is there, unmistakably, in the stories neighboring nations told about Israel when the fires of war had burned cold. What it was, and why it was done, would leave even the brutal standards of the ancient world shaken. You think you've heard the worst? You haven't. In ancient Israel, bloodlines were not simply a matter of family pride, they were instruments of power, property, and prophecy. The question of who could bear whose child was not left to love or chance. It was dictated, controlled, and enforced, even when it meant bending the will of the unwilling. Within the clan, marriages could be forced to preserve inheritance rights. A widow might be compelled to marry her dead husband's brother, not for companionship, but to produce an heir who would legally belong to the deceased. Her body became a vessel for a lineage that was no longer hers to shape. Refusal could bring shame, not to the man, but to her. In some cases, the control was even harsher. Fathers could betroth daughters before they were old enough to understand what marriage meant. These unions cemented alliances, merged land holdings, or reinforced the prestige of the family name. Consent was irrelevant, the honor of the house was the only measure that mattered. When war or political instability loomed, bloodline control tightened. Intermarriage with certain foreign groups was forbidden outright, seen as a contamination of the covenant. Yet in other contexts, strategic unions with outsiders were commanded, turning daughters and sisters into diplomatic currency. A single wedding could avert war, or ignite it. The consequences echoed for generations. Children born from forced unions carried the weight of expectation or the stain of exclusion. A single drop of wrong blood could strip a person of rights, bar them from temple service, or mark them as an outsider in their own land. The law codes are clear, these practices were sanctioned, not secret. They were recorded in the same breath as property laws and sacrificial instructions, as though the control of the womb was as sacred as the altar itself. If you've watched this far without subscribing, you're proving that you can take from this work without giving back. Think about how much research it takes to bring you what you just heard, and then tell me in the comments why you think that effort isn't worth a click. When the armies of Israel marched, they did not return with only spoils of gold and livestock. They brought back human lives, most often women, taken from the smoking ruins of conquered cities. The law spoke with a strange mixture of restraint and possession. A man could take a captive woman for his wife, but first, she must be brought into his home. Her head was to be shaved, her nails trimmed, her clothes replaced with those of her captors. She was given 1 month to mourn her parents, her homeland, her life, a ritual that was both an acknowledgement of loss and a final erasure of who she had been. Only then, the law said, could the man go into her and make her his wife. If later she no longer pleased him, he could release her, but never sell her, for she had been humiliated. The language tried to wrap control in the cloth of protection, yet the reality was clear. She was property, acquired in war, integrated into a household that had destroyed her own. In practice, this legal framework was often ignored or twisted. Captives could be taken without ceremony, forced into service or concubinage without the month of mourning. War blurred the line between law and convenience, and the victor's desire outweighed the written code. These women lived as both insiders and outsiders. Wives in name, yet never free from the reminder that their presence in the household began with conquest. Their children bore the complicated inheritance of belonging to the house of their mother's captor. In the ancient economy of power, a captive woman was not only a sign of victory but an asset. She could increase the household's labor, expand its lineage, and, in the eyes of her captor, bind her people's defeat into the next generation. Picture the public square, its heat thick with dust and the murmurs of a gathered crowd. At the center stands the accused, not hidden behind closed doors, but exposed for all to see. In ancient Israel, sexuality could be weaponized, not for pleasure, but for punishment, and humiliation was as much the sentence as any fine or exile. There were cases where a woman, accused of adultery or impropriety, could be forced into rituals designed to strip away her dignity. Clothes torn or loosened, hair disheveled, body made vulnerable before the eyes of neighbors, every element was deliberate, a slow unmaking of her public worth. The act was not random cruelty, it was a message. In a world where honor and shame were currencies more powerful than silver, such exposure declared her unfit, cursed, set apart. It reminded the watching crowd that sexuality was not private, it was a tool the community could wield to enforce obedience. Sometimes, the humiliation took political form. Captive kings could have their beards shorn and garments cut to expose them in ways that branded them powerless before both gods and men. In these moments, the body itself became a stage for dominance, its shame a warning to others. And yet, these scenes rarely survive in their raw form in later retellings. Scribes softened the language, framing them as symbolic gestures or religious necessities. What they concealed was the raw reality. The tightening of the crowd, the laughter of enemies, the unbearable knowledge that your shame was now part of public memory. You've just learned something most people will never know. If you leave without subscribing, you're choosing to keep it to yourself instead of helping spread it. Which one are you going to be? Centuries pass, and yet the shadows of these customs cling to the edges of our modern world. Laws written long after the dust of ancient Israel settled still carry echoes of its judgments. The idea that a woman's worth can be bound to her sexual history. The belief that male honor must be defended through control over the bodies of others. The quiet persistence of marriage as transaction, even when dressed in romance. Some practices are gone, the public square no longer stages ritual humiliation, and the temple no longer demands offerings of the flesh. But others have shifted rather than vanished, their forms changed, their spirit intact. The notion of purity, for example, still haunts certain laws and faiths. Gender roles forged under the weight of tribal honor still dictate who is protected and who is sacrificed. Even the legal systems of nations that would claim no tie to the Hebrew past have inherited the skeleton of its codes. Terms may be modernized, punishments softened, but the underlying currents of control, over sex, over choice, over the body, flow on. And if you think these parallels are distant, you need only look at the way scandal is still weaponized today. Social exile for perceived moral failings. Public trials by opinion. Bodies reduced to symbols in a struggle for dominance. We have traded the city gate for the news cycle, the priest's decree for the viral headline. The stage is new, but the play is old. It is here, in this uncomfortable recognition, that the past reaches forward and grips you by the collar. This is not only their history, it is yours. If you've watched this far without supporting tale of history, you've taken from the work without helping it live on. These are the truths that vanish if left untold, and you decide whether they die here or are carried forward. There is one detail I left buried until now, a fragment tucked deep in an overlooked commentary, almost forgotten. When we spoke of war captives, I told you about integration into households. What I did not tell you is that some records suggest a period of deliberate degradation before that integration took place. A month-long ritual in which the captive woman was made to mourn publicly, her hair shorn, her clothes replaced with plain garments, not as compassion, but as a performance of loss meant to break her spirit before she was claimed. It was not only a stripping away of her identity. It was a slow erasure, the quiet killing of who she had been so that she might fit the role imposed upon her. And here is the most disturbing part, in some cases, this ritual was framed as an act of mercy, a way to ease her transition into a new life. That was the justification, as if the crushing of a soul could ever be kindness. We like to imagine that cruelty is easy to recognize, that evil wears sharp edges. But history tells us that some of the darkest acts were wrapped in the language of care. And I wonder, how many such acts still hide in plain sight today, dressed in words that make them palatable? Tale of history has done its part, now it's on you. If you can watch, learn, and then walk away without subscribing, at least have the courage to explain why in the comments. Because silence is exactly how history gets buried. We have walked through the shadows of ancient Israel. Through rituals, laws, and unspoken customs that shaped lives, controlled bodies, and dictated fates. These were not isolated acts, but part of a web of belief and power that reached into every corner of daily life. If you think this was disturbing, what waits in the archives of ancient Egypt is far darker. In our next investigation, we'll uncover the most unsettling rituals performed under the gaze of gods carved in stone. Acts so extraordinary that even their own scribes sometimes refuse to write them down. Tale of history, because what they tried to erase, we bring back to light.